This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and today we're continuing with my full set limited review of Innistrad Crimson Vow. We kicked it off yesterday with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards, and today we're continuing with a look at all the white cards. A few caveats before we get to our first card. Keep in mind, I'm only talking about limited. I'm not talking about other formats or any cards that don't appear in draft boosters for this set. Also, these are my initial thoughts about the format before playing with the cards. I will put out videos with my updated thoughts on these cards over the next several weeks. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to help sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you don't know what those letter grades mean, there's an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first white card. First up, it's Adamant Will, which for one generic and a white is a common instant that says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains indestructible until end of turn. We've seen this card a few times now. It's always a kind of reasonable trick. The boost it gives is enough to win just about any combat, and the indestructibility means you can even use it to save a creature from most removal spells. It is still a trick, and comes with all the inherent downsides those come with, like being situational and sometimes risky. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Angelic Quartermaster, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 Angel Soldier at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it puts a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. This is really good. Obviously, it would have been way better if it could put one of its +1/+1 counters on itself, but that would be kind of crazy. But because it doesn't say that, you do have to have 2 other creatures around when you play it to get full value. But that's fine. After all, it's 5 mana to add 5/5 to the board, and at least 3/3 of that has an evasive keyword ability, and because it costs 5, having 2 other things will happen reasonably often. This will be a top curve thing that really changes the board. It will really regularly find a way to create attacks that just weren't there before, and she gives you value even if she dies right away. Also, +1/+1 counters are a big theme in this set, especially in green-white. So yeah, this is a great uncommon, one you can take pretty highly, and I think you should value pretty significantly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Arm the Cathars, which for 1 generic and 2 white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +3/+3, up to 1 other target creature gets +2/+2, and up to 1 other target creature gets +1/+1. Those creatures gain Vigilance until end of turn. This is an interesting card, and one that I think is actually pretty reasonable in aggressive decks. I don't normally love sorcery speed ways to buff your whole board, but this does it so efficiently that I think I like it. +6/+6 worth of stats spread across 3 creatures and Vigilance is going to be enough to enable attacks on a whole lot of boards between the stats and the fact that you still have the creatures hang back to block, which really matters in a race, and adding Vigilance here is no small thing. Sure, you do need a board state for this to do its thing, and you have to be a little cautious about when you use it, but it seems like this can bust a game wide open early and break through a stalled board late, and that seems like a pretty nice card overall, even if it is situational. It also seems like it'll work pretty nicely with training. I think you'll want the first one in aggressive white decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bride's Gown, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact equipment. It gives the equipped creature +2/+0, and that creature gains an additional +0/+2, and has first strike as long as an equipment named Groom's Finery is attached to a creature you control, and it has an equip cost of 2. 2 to play, and 2 to equip for +2/+0 is a sort of decent rate. It enables attacks you didn't have before, although not raising toughness isn't something I love, since it generally means your creature won't have a better chance of surviving combat. We've seen equipment with the same cost and boost before, and they're usually not that great. However, with training, a pretty big mechanic in white, I do think you end up playing this as your 23rd or 24th card a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. And yeah, I know it gets better if you pair it with Groom's Finery, a card we'll see later in the week, but they are both uncommon, so getting more than 1 copy of each isn't ultra likely, and getting them both in play at the same time won't happen a ton either, though when it does, it will be nice. It is kind of a bummer, though, that both of them are kind of mediocre when the other card's not around, so the cost of running them is pretty significant. Next up, it's By Invitation Only, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery, and it says choose a number between 0 and 13. Each player sacrifices that many creatures. This has a neat design, and it looks super good. This is an entirely customizable Wrath effect, and that seems very powerful. If you just want to blow everything up, you pick 13. But what makes it extra great is that you can use it in situations where your creatures outnumber your opponents already to wipe their whole board and hold on to some of your stuff. Basically, you're going to get a reset button to bail you out of an unwinnable situation, or you can use it to put yourself way ahead of your opponent on the board. That's definitely a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Cemetery Protector, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 3/4 human soldier at Mythic Rare. It's got Flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile a card from a graveyard. Whenever you play a land or cast a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, you make a 1/1 white human creature token. This looks great to me. A 4-mana 3/4 with Flash is already fairly playable since it's the right size to come in and really ambush stuff, but the added graveyard hate and the ability to generate creature tokens is huge. You can cast this at the end of your opponent's turn and hit a card that has the same type as something you're playing on your turn, and you're already getting really good value. Anything beyond that is going to be really insane, and this will just generate a whole lot of creature tokens. I think this gets into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Circle of Confinement, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until Circle of Confinement leaves the battlefield. And whenever an opponent casts a vampire spell with the same name as a card exiled with Circle of Confinement, you gain 2 life. This is pretty interesting. The vampire part of the card mostly won't matter in limited. You have to be exiling something your opponent has multiple copies of, after all. So mostly this is a 2-mana removal spell that gets rid of mana value 3 or less things for 2 mana. That's just enough for me to be premium removal, especially in a set with disturbed creatures, most of which are small enough that this can kill them. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Donhart Geiss, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 Spirit Warlock at uncommon, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 2 life. This has passable stats and an ability that will gain you some life. There are a decent number of enchantments in white, so I think you'll pretty much always end up playing it. The life gain is welcome in the black-white deck, and the enchantment payoff is welcome in blue-white, but I don't think you're overjoyed for it in either of those decks. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Distracting Geiss, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 spirit at uncommon. When it attacks, you tap target creature defending player controls, and it has Disturb, a returning mechanic, which pretty much works the same as last time, except when things disturb this time, they come back as auras. In this case, Distracting Geiss comes back as Clever Distraction, an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says, enchanted creature has, whenever this creature attacks, tap target creature defending player controls, and like all disturbed cards, if it's in the aura form, it gets exiled when it goes away. This kind of creature always overperforms. Tapping down a defending creature is a huge deal and really alters how your opponent plays the game. Being a 2/1 is a bit of a bummer, but the fact that you can disturb this later in the game to give a more formidable creature that powerful ability is very appealing to me. I think you can take this with the first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Drogskull Infantry, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Spirit Soldier at common. It's got Disturb for 3 generic and a white, and it comes back as the aura Drogskull Armaments, which has Enchant Creature, and Enchanted Creature gets +2/+2. This looks like a nice common to me. It's a bear on one side, and then it can come back as a pretty relevant aura in the later part of the game. Look at it as a creature who can trade and leave an aura behind, and you're looking at something pretty good. Giving this a C+. Next up, it's Estwald Shield Basher, which for 3 generic and a white is a 4/2 human soldier at common. When it attacks, you can pay 1 generic, and if you do, it gains indestructible until end of turn. This doesn't have great stats for the cost, but the ability to become indestructible when it attacks definitely makes up for that. Especially in a format that likes putting +1/+1 counters and auras on things, this is the kind of creature that can carry those things really effectively because your opponent just won't be able to block it in combat effectively very often. It is still quite vulnerable outside of combat, but I can see this card really overperforming in a set that has those 2 mechanical things going on, and I think that makes it a C+. Next up, it's Faithbound Judge, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 4/4 Spirit Soldier at Mythic Rare. It's got Defender, Flying, and Vigilance, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, if Faithbound Judge has 2 or fewer judgment counters on it, put a judgment counter on it, and as long as it has 3 or more judgment counters on it, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender, and it has Disturb for 5 generic and 2 white, and it comes back as the Aura Curse Sinner's Judgment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a judgment counter on Sinner's Judgment. Then, if there are 3 or more judgment counters on it, enchanted player loses the game. This is a neat card. So, first up, a 3-mana 4/4 with Flying and Defender is already a card you'd play, especially in slower decks. It has great stats for the cost and can block pretty much everything for a very long time, but the great thing is it doesn't stay that way. It will take a few turns, but eventually the judge can actually attack, and then if your opponent manages to kill it, you can disturb it late to put your opponent on something of a fast clock. Of course, it costs 7 mana to disturb, so it will be hard to get there consistently. Now, all the stuff with these counters is super slow, and there are going to be times where this card just doesn't get you there because it's so slow, and that means it's definitely not a bomb. I mean, imagine top decking this in the later part of the game. It's going to be pretty miserable, and that's not usually what a bomb's going to do. It'll come down and be able to block maybe, but that's just not going to be enough on a lot of board states. So I'm giving this a B overall. Next up, it's Fierce Retribution, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It's got Cleave. This is a new mechanic they introduced in this set where you pay an alternate cost, and you remove words in square brackets on the card when you do. This has Cleave for 5 generic and a white, and it says destroy target attacking creature with attacking in brackets. This is a nice common. 2 mana to kill an attacking creature is often a card that makes the cut, and it's like a C+ in most formats. You don't love it if you're aggressive because it doesn't get blockers out of the way, but it is efficient enough to be fine. Adding the late game upside of Cleave does enough to get this into the lower range of first pickable, I think. It's funny because neither way you can cast this will feel like premium removal, but the option between a couple of C+ removal spells is enough for this to be a B- for me. Next up, it's Fleeting Spirit, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 spirit at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and exile 3 cards from your graveyard to give it first strike until end of turn. You can also discard a card and exile it and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is a nice aggressive creature. You can attack with it for free a lot of the time, since if things go sideways, you can just flicker it. It is a little annoying. It's in a set that cares about +1, +1 counters and auras because its ability to flicker doesn't combine with those well at all. But that's okay. It's still a 2 mana 3/1 with some significant upside. You're going to be pretty happy to have it as a 2-drop in your aggressive decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we've got Griff Rider, which is 2 generic and a white for a 2/1 human knight at common with flying and training. Training is a new mechanic in this set where, when a creature attacks with another creature that has greater power, it gets a +1, +1 counter. So basically, it's reverse Mentor. This looks like a pretty nice common. Because it has flying, it will often be able to attack with other creatures that are bigger than it, so it can grow throughout the game, and even just getting 1 counter on it will feel great. This seems like the kind of common that will be the bread and butter of aggressive decks in this format. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Griffwing Cavalry, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/2 human knight at uncommon. It's got flying, it has training, and when it attacks, you can pay 1 generic and a white, and if you do, target attacking creature without flying gains flying until end of turn. Back-to-back nice flyers with training. A 4 mana 2/2 flyer isn't that impressive, but the fact it can bring a creature to the sky with it increases your chances of being able to trigger training, and this will just keep getting bigger while attacking with other creatures it gives flying. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Hallowed Haunting, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a mythic rare enchantment. It says as long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a white spirit cleric creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of spirits you control. So obviously you need a decent number of enchantments or this is useless, and you probably shouldn't really expect to get the flying and vigilance part going ever in limited. However, the ability to make creature tokens is worth it in the right deck, and in particular, that deck will usually be the blue-white one, which will be able to run a bunch of enchantments in the form of disturbed creatures, and that's also the color pair that will have the most spirits. You probably need like 7 enchantments for this to work, and ending up with that many in that deck won't be as hard as it normally would be because of Disturb, but it's not going to be easy either, especially because you need a nice mix of spirits and enchantments to really take advantage of this. And while some cards are both of those, they're only one of those on one side or the other, so you won't get the value of having both at the same time. Obviously, this is a build-around because I think it's an F or close to it in just about every white deck, but it has an impressive ceiling. Cranking out those tokens really is no joke. I think its realistic ceiling in a good blue-white deck is a B+. Next up, it's Heron of Hope, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 bird. At common, it's got flying. If you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead, and you can pay 1 generic and a white, and it gains lifelink until end of turn. This doesn't have great stats, but it is a nice little life gain enhancer, and the fact it can gain life itself means it does stuff on its own, like it's going to gain you 3 life when it hits your opponent instead of 2 if you use its ability. Seems solid, I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Heron Blessed Geiss, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/3 spirit. At common, it's got flying, and you can pay 3 generic and a white to exile it from your graveyard to get 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. Activate only if you control an enchantment and only as a sorcery. This seems solid. I mean, a 5 mana 3/3 flyer isn't great. It's sort of passable, probably about a D+. The fact it can do its ability out of the graveyard is pretty nice, but it is a little annoying that you have to have an enchantment or it's not going to do its thing, and that mostly means this only works out for you in the blue-white deck. When it does do that thing from the graveyard, it's going to feel great and close to a 2-for-1, so the upside is real. It's just kind of annoying you have to jump through hoops to actually get those spirit tokens, but hopefully those hoops won't be too hard to jump through. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Hopeful Initiate, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 human warlock at rare with training, and you can pay 2 generic and a white and remove 2 +1/+1 counters from among creatures you control to destroy target artifact or enchantment. A 1 mana 1/2 with training is a decent card already, and that's mostly what this will feel like, though of course having the disenchant effect as an option is nice. There are going to be times where you have stuff to blow up with it, whether it's, a disturb thing or whatever. And it's going to be growing pretty quickly. If you can curve out with this after turn 1, it's going to get pretty impressive in most situations. If you're not curving out, it's not really going to be doing much. I think overall it just ends up being a C. If the disenchant ends up being a little better in this format, then I think it may go up. And I could also see the training here on turn 1 being better than I think as well. But overall, this card just looks fine and limited and not much more than that. Next up, it's Katilda, Donhart, Martyr, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a star legendary spirit warlock at rare. She has flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires. Her power and toughness are each equal to the number of permanents you control that are spirits and or enchantments, and she has disturb for 3 generic and 2 white. She comes back as Katilda's Rising Dawn, an enchant creature aura, a legendary one, and an enchanted creature gets flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires, and it gets +X/+X, where X is the number of permanents you control that are spirits and or enchantments. This looks quite good. So let's assume your deck has 0 other enchantments or spirits. That won't be the case, but it's a good place to start. In that deck, she'd be a 3 mana 1/1 with flying, lifelink, and protection from a relevant creature type, which can disturb into an aura that gives +1/+1 flying, lifelink, and protection from that same creature type. That'd already be a pretty nice card. The aura granting those keywords and stats boost is especially nice, and you're going to really feel like you get 2 cards of value out of this. And the thing is, your deck is going to have way more spirits and enchantments than that. Even just having her be a 2/2 or the aura give +2/+2 is a huge upgrade. She's obviously at her best in blue-white, which is the most spirit and enchantment happy deck, but because the baseline is so reasonable, you can probably play her in any white deck and be reasonably happy. I think dealing with either side of this, and especially the aura side, is going to sometimes be a real nightmare. Life gain and flying together is just amazing. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Kindly Ancestor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 spirit. At common, it's got lifelink, and it can disturb for 1 generic and a white, and it becomes an aura called Ancestor's Embrace, and it gives the enchanted creature lifelink. This is a fine common. A 3 mana 2/3 with lifelink is probably a C in this set because you have auras and +1/+1 counters that make that a little better. Giving lifelink to evasive creatures after it dies can be especially nice. It just completely alters races. I think that means this comes out as a C+. Next up, it's Lanternflare, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare instant. It has cleave for X, red, and white, and it says Lanternflare deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life. And in brackets, it says X is the number of creatures you control. This looks really good. I think you do basically always want to at least be splashing red to have the opportunity to get full value out of it, but 2 mana to do 1 for each creature you control and gain that much life is already a good card. It definitely takes some setup, but as long as you have 2 creatures or more, you're getting an okay deal that just scales. Of course, it gets way more flexible if you can cleave it, and being an X damage spell at instant speed that gains you life is pretty serious. Overall, this looks really nice. It's effectively a split card with 2 pretty nice options. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Militia Rallier, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 human soldier at common. It can't attack alone, and when it does attack, you can untap target creature. This has efficient stats, even if it can't attack alone. And the good news is it can block alone, and does a pretty good job of that. And as long as he has some friends, it can rumble too, while untapping a creature, so it has Pseudovigilance because it can untap itself. On top of that, it's nice size for training your creatures too. This seems like a nice comment. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Nebelgast Beguiler, which for 4 generic and a white is a 2/5 spirit at common. You can pay 1 white and tap it to tap target creature. Master Decoy type effects tend to play pretty well in limited, sort of becoming like removal in the very late part of the game. The creature here is very clunky and unimpressive though, and it's a defensive creature that has to tap to use its ability, and that's kind of annoying. I think you'll cut this a decent chunk of the time, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Nurturing Presence, which for 1 generic and a white is a common aura with Enchant Creature. Enchanted Creature has, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And when Nurturing Presence enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So this gives you a 1/1 flyer no matter what, and that helps mitigate the risk of playing an aura. It's too bad the rest of the card isn't very good though. The stats boost is situational and unimpressive. The turn you play it, it will be giving +1/+1 to the thing, but still, it's not even always going to have a stats boost, and that means you're not doing a great job. Auras do matter in this format, so I do think this narrowly gets out of being a D just because of synergy, and I think it's probably a C-. It really is disappointing. As soon as I saw that line of text that you get a card that actually adds to the board when you play this, I was pretty excited for an awesome aura. Like, even if it just gave permanent +1/+1, this would be a really good card, but it doesn't, so I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Allenbach Escort, which for 1 white is a 1/1 human cleric at uncommon. It's got Vigilance, and you can sacrifice it, and target creature you control, the +1/+1 counter on it gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. A 1-mana 1/1 with Vigilance is kind of alright in this format. Like I've been saying, there's an aura deck and a +1/+1 counter deck in white, but this gets a lot better with its ability to make something gain lifelink and indestructibility. Those two keywords are huge, and this is going to have some serious impact on the board if you have a creature with counter somewhere, as your opponent has to respect the ability or get completely wrecked. Still, it's probably situational enough that it's just a C. Next up, it's Panicked Bystander, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human peasant at uncommon. Whenever it or another creature you control dies, you gain 1 life. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, you transform Panicked Bystander, and it becomes Cackling Culprit, a 3/5 human rogue with the same ability. Whenever it or another creature dies, you gain 1 life, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to give it Death Touch until end of turn. You would always play a 2-mana 2/2 that gains you life every time a creature you control dies, especially in a format with a life gain archetype. I always love limited cards that help you do the thing and then pay you off for the thing, because that means they can fuel themselves, and that's what we have here. Gaining 3 life and transforming this seems very doable, especially once you add a little more life gain to the mix, and this thing is a pretty tough customer once it's a 3/5 that can gain Death Touch. This seems like a very nice uncommon with a fine floor and a really nice ceiling. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Parish Blade Trainee, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/2 human soldier at common with training, and when it dies, you put its counters on target creature you control. This will get bigger relatively easily since it starts with 1 power, but one kind of awkward thing about it is, if you play this as your 2-drop, it almost definitely won't be growing on turn 3. It's nice that it pays you off for counter stuff more generally too, but this seems pretty awkward to curve out with, and that's kind of not the sentence you want to be saying about a white card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Piercing Light, which for 1 white mana is a common instant and deals 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and you scry 1. This kills X2s pretty efficiently, but it's too situational. The creature has to be small and attacking or blocking. Scry is, of course, some nice additional value, but this falls well short of being premium removal. It's just a solid playable, giving it a C. Next up, it's Radiant Grace, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+0 in Vigilance, and when the enchanted creature dies, you return Radiant Grace to the battlefield transformed under your control attached to target opponent, and it becomes Radiant Restraints, which is an uncommon aura curse that enchants a player, and the enchanted player has all their creatures into the battlefield tapped. This format has a lot of auras that do an excellent job of getting around the 2-for-1 risk of auras, and this one pretty much gets there. 1 mana for +1/+0 in Vigilance isn't an exciting boost, and probably wouldn't be a card you're super interested in playing, but the fact that it comes back as a curse is nice. Now, just the curse side of this also isn't great, but when you staple the 2 cards together, you end up with a very playable card, especially in blue-white, which loves enchantments. The curse side is going to be nice if you're aggressive, especially because, your opponent's creatures won't be able to block right away, and that's pretty cool. I'm giving this a C overall. Next up, it's Resistance Squad, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human soldier at uncommon. And when it enters the battlefield, if you control another human, you draw a card. This looks really good. Green-white has the most humans, but every white deck in this format will have enough humans for you to play this, and when you get to draw that card, you're getting quite the 2-for-1, as this 3/2 can really effectively trade or attack. I don't even think it's necessary to give it a build-around grade, since drawing a card with it won't be that hard to make happen, giving this a B. Next up, it's Sanctify, which for 1 generic and a white is a common sorcery, and it says destroy target artifact or enchantment, you gain 3 life. This is good at destroying enchantments and artifacts, and I think there are enough of them that sometimes maybe this ends up in your main deck, but you're probably not going to be thrilled about it. While there are lots of auras, blowing up the disturbed side of a card isn't really going to be a 1-for-1 and won't feel that great all the time, and I think that limits how good this is in your main deck. I think it's probably a D if you have to play it there, and a C as a sideboard card. Next up, it's Savior of Allenbach, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 1/2 human soldier at Mythic Rare. It has Training, and when it trains, you exile up to 1 other target creature from the battlefield or creature card from a graveyard. When it leaves the battlefield, put the exiled cards onto the battlefield under their owner's control. This takes some setup to do its thing, but once it's doing it, it will do a pretty good impression of Vicious Cathar from the last set. Ideally, you play this on turn 3 when you have a 2-power creature around and attack on the next turn, removing your opponent's most relevant creature, and things can really snowball from there. It probably won't be super easy to get it to exile more than a couple things, and you eventually have to stop attacking because it will get outclassed, but it will really swing the game wildly in your favor. And then, in the late game, your opponent has to make sure they are leaving back enough blockers that they can survive this triggering. And, importantly, you can also use it to exile stuff from your graveyard in the late game, which will put your opponent in an awkward position. They can't kill it, or you'll start reanimating stuff. I think this does enough amazing stuff in the early game and the mid to late game that I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Sagardas Imprisonment, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and you can pay 4 generic and a white to exile the creature and get a blood token. This is white's usual aura-based premium removal. Now, there's a very real chance this is worse than normal since Exploit is in the format, but I still think the efficiency of the card is worth it. 3 mana completely removes the card from combat, allowing you to attack and take advantage right away, and it's nice that in the late game you can get rid of the creature entirely and get a blood token out of the deal. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Sagardas Summons, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment. It says creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have base power and toughness 4/4, have flying, and are angels in addition to their other types. So green-white has a lot of +1/+1 counters around. We've seen a lot of white cards with +1/+1 counter stuff already. And that's true even apart from the training mechanic, and I think that probably means this is very realistic to build around in that color pair, and even outside of that color pair, if you have enough cards that give you +1/+1 counters, you could be happy with it. Now, the downside of the card is that it costs a whopping 6 mana, and will only do a thing if you're set up for it. Otherwise, it won't impact the board at all, and that's brutal. You need to have a lot of +1/+1 counter stuff going on for this to be worth it. And I think that means it needs a build-around grade. It's going to be an F, like in your typical white deck. Like if you have 3 cards that put +1/+1 counters on things, that's not enough. You shouldn't play it. But if you really get there, I do think it's a B, and it may even go up into bomb range. I'm a little skeptical about it just because it costs so much mana, and I also don't love that it doesn't have any effect that inherently adds to the board. It just changes creatures, which, yeah, that's like a big Anthem effect, but that does weaken it somewhat. Next up, it's Supernatural Rescue, which for 3 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura. It has flash as long as you control a spirit, and when you cast it, you tap up to 2 target creatures you don't control. It has enchant creature you control, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+2. If you can get this to have flash, it'll be kind of nice, as you can use it to prevent 1 round of attacks and blocks, and you can also get the stats boost at instant speed, which sometimes can be a nice combat trick. When it doesn't have flash, it is super clunky, though tapping down a couple of things can often make some more attacks possible. Still, the mana cost is pretty high here, and you won't have much reason to run auras like this when you can just run creatures with Disturb who are far more useful up front. Even with the Spirit upside and being, in an aura color pair like blue-white, I don't see myself playing this a ton. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 legendary human soldier at rare. She's got first strike, and non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. This is a neat reprint. A 2-mana 2/1 with first strike is a nice card for limited, and this one comes with a tax effect. Now, it isn't exactly like you'll be playing her in a deck with 0 cards that are affected by the tax, but generally speaking, you're going to be coming out ahead when you play this, since you're the one who has such an efficient creature, and your opponent meanwhile suffers from the tax without any upside. Obviously, you don't want to be in like a spell deck if you're playing Thalia, but if you're in white, that's very unlikely to happen anyway. She does die to a whole lot, but because she makes the stuff she dies from cost more mana most of the time, that's not a big deal, especially since she only costs 2. I think she's a B-. Next up, it's Traveling Minister, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human cleric at common. You can tap it, and target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and you gain 1 life. Activate only as a sorcery. This common gains life, which black-white likes, and it can set up training a little better, which green-white likes, but it doesn't do either thing very well, and as a 1 mana 1/1, it just doesn't feel like this will be impactful often enough. The sorcery speed only thing is killer. I don't think you play this very often. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Twin Bladegeist, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 spirit warrior. At uncommon, it's got double strike, and it can be disturbed for 2 generic and a white, and it becomes Twin Blade Invocation, an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and the enchanted creature gets double strike. The best of these cards that have disturb are the ones that on the front are really good places to put auras because they have a keyword ability, and then when they can be disturbed later, they're great to put on other creatures, and that's what you have here. You can put auras on Twin Bladegeist to make it really scary because it has double strike. You can also put +1/+1 counters on it. And then in the later part of the game, you can give double strike to something with a larger body that makes things really difficult for your opponent. And I think the whole package here is a B-. Next up, it's Unholy Officiant, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 vampire cleric at common with Vigilance, and you can pay 4 generic and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on it. A 1 mana 1/2 with Vigilance isn't great. This kind of card gets outclassed and limited pretty quickly. That said, at least it comes with an ability that does a thing in the late game, even if 5 is a lot for a single counter. It's also not a bad place to put counters or auras because it has Vigilance. This seems like an alright 1-drop that you'll play in your most aggressive decks, but it doesn't look that great anywhere else, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Valorous Stance, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, or destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. This is a reprint, and it was pretty nice and limited last time. We usually get an effect that costs 3 or 4 and kills big things, so having it at 2 mana is a huge upgrade, and if it doesn't have a target, the other mode can come up. You can use it to save a creature, sometimes creating big blowouts. While as a removal spell, I don't think it's quite premium on its own, I think the upside of the additional mode does do enough to make this a B-. Next up, it's Vampire Slayer, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at common, and when it deals damage to a vampire, you destroy that creature. This set has a lot of vampires, but not so many that a 2 mana 2/2 that kills vampires in combat is that great. This is especially true because many vampires are already kind of small, and this can trade with them anyway. I think this is just a C-. Next up, it's Voice of the Blessed, which for 2 white mana is a 2/2 spirit cleric at rare. Whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. As long as it has 4 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it has Flying and Vigilance, and as long as it has 10 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it has Indestructible. Obviously, this is a really, really good life gain payoff, and this format has a legit life gain deck. It is in most ways a better Ajani's Pridemate. It will be really great in a deck that goes hard on life gain, but it has a pretty good baseline as a 2 mana 2/2, and it also likes the +1/+1 counters regardless of where they come from, which could make it a nice fit for green-white too. It getting Flying and Vigilance is something that will happen reasonably often, but you probably shouldn't expect it to ever be indestructible. By the point it has that many +1/+1 counters, your opponent will probably be dead anyway. I think most decks will get some nice performances out of this card. It has a reasonable floor and a very high ceiling, giving it a B. Next up, it's Wedding Announcement, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. It says at the beginning of your instep, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. If you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card, otherwise create a 1/1 white human creature token. Then, if Wedding Announcement has 3 or more invitation counters on it, transform it. And it becomes Wedding Festivity, which is a rare enchantment that's an anthem. It gives your whole board +1/+1. This looks pretty good to me. Sure, it will be a bit slow in the late game sometimes, but the fact that it gives you value the turn you play it definitely matters. Generally, drawing a card is going to be better than getting a 1/1, but you will take either. Then a few turns later, it becomes an anthem, and that's certainly going to make your board into something pretty scary. Whether you've been making tokens or drawing extra cards, you're probably going to be able to go pretty wide. I think this is a B+, and can we also take a moment to enjoy the fact that a card that involves a wedding announcement also has the number +1/+1 somewhere on it? Anyway, on to our next card, which is Welcoming Vampire, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 vampire at rare. It's got flying, and whenever 1 or more other creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control draw a card, this ability triggers only once each turn. This is really good. A 3-mana 2/3 flyer is already like a C, and this comes with an ability that will draw you a card every now and then, and even if you only net one card from it, you're going to be doing pretty well. Anything beyond that, and you're doing great. Without even trying, your deck will have lots of creatures who trigger this. I'm giving this a B+. Alright, that's our last white card, and that's how I feel about all the white cards in Innistrad Crimson Vow. I'll be back tomorrow with a look at all the blue cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review coming out over the next several days, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including more of this set review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you enjoy my content and want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my content, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.